Mm. All right, folks, welcome to our brand new channel here on YouTube. Also, we'll be on BitChute and Brighteon and Rockfin. So all those independent-minded platforms, in addition to here on YouTube, Stopping the Who. And I'll also be having my friend James Roguski on again to help. But today we've got a very special guest. He is currently the Libertarian vice presidential nominee. So that's quite a title. And we had him on before. His name is Mike ter Maat. Mike, how are you today, sir?
Great. It's a joy to be with you. Thank you, David. I'm honored to be with you as you're relaunching this program. I think it's absolutely terrific.
Right. And so the channel is focused primarily on what I would consider to be a global health takeover. And I've done a lot of research on this, and my friend James, he's very involved with these negotiations that go on at the WHO. And um, quite honestly, some of the things that happen over there are disturbing. And the United States involved itself in the WHO decades ago without really reading the fine print, where they're able to kind of do and say whatever they want to do. And it's another one of these unaccountable global institutions like the World Economic Forum, and NATO, which is another organization you and I'm sure, could have great discussions about. But what are your thoughts on the way the WHO is set up, and how can we as a country unravel ourselves from this?
Well, we can unravel ourselves in any number of ways. I think it's important for your audience to understand, first of all, that the WHO is an independent organization which believes, and we're going to talk about why it believes this, it believes that its authority supersedes that of national governments. And this is a real shame. It believes that its authority is at the level of committed treaties, and therefore its member nations are committed and in some sense obliged to follow policy that the WHO develops, yes, in conjunction with the participation of its member nations, but the WHO has an independent staff, independent leadership, independent frame of mind, frame of reference. And in this sense, it's a relatively undemocratic organization with members, yes, but it believes it can shove down the throats of its members what it believes it wants to see done. And this, I believe, is why it's so important for a voice like yours to talk about this. It's not only a medical issue, a science issue more broadly, but it's a control issue. And it was interesting, you characterized it as a medical takeover, which of course is correct. But I would also throw on that pile, it's more than just a medical takeover, right? Because it is a policy takeover. It's a governance takeover. And to the extent to which we, as American citizens, as folks that participate in the policy discussion in the United States, to the extent to which we tolerate this, I believe that we run the risk not only of subjugating our own policy to that of other unaccountable bureaucrats and unaccountable to us, politicians from around the world, but we run the risk of two things that I think are worth fighting against in addition to all that. One is the WHO getting in its head that it should be even more powerful than it is today, right? If we don't stand against it now, these types of organizations, they don't shrink. They don't say, well, we've done enough. They grow. They grow in terms of scale, in scope, in power. They seek to consolidate their power and their control. The other risk that I think that we run is that other organizations, I should say other people, will get it into their head that it's a model that can work. And other people will form other organizations You brought up NATO, interesting example, right? One might argue that the WHO looked at NATO and said, that's a model that we could pursue. I fear that others will look at this model and say, wow, we don't get our way inside of national governments as often as we wish we would. Maybe there's a model that would help us supersede that and get our way in a different, even less democratic fashion. And all of this is to say nothing of the fact that the policies that the WHO pursues are crappy, which
Mm-hmm.
they are. In
Mm-hmm.
other words, there's really a couple of different problems going on here. And I commend you for turning over that rock.
Yeah. Well, the more you turn over that rock, the more you find just incredible information. The WHO is obviously a body that, as you rightfully talk about here, is really concerned with accumulating power, and they do this in several different ways. And you being a libertarian and being into the free market, right? There's a and I'm not saying you're the only one into the free market. All I'm saying is libertarians believe in free market principles, and so what I'm getting at here is I've noticed that there is this very strange and incestuous um, combination of corporate power and what you would consider free market power, although it's not truly free if it's colluding with governments around the world. During the last episode that we experienced back in 20, and in some cases we're still experiencing in some areas of the world because they have not completely decoupled from any of this, and people walking around give me that impression as well. But those are side issues. I'm getting at here, Mike, is that there seems to be this collusion, and we find it here in the United States with other uh, businesses like Amazon doing really well during the pandemic, like just all of that wealth that they accumulated and all of those small businesses that were told to shut down. Um, we're looking at kind of this global monopoly of power, and the WHO is essentially doing the bidding and saying, "Hey, we'd love to partner with your country." They're doing it with the global South to some degree now. Africa wants to get in on these super safe and effective products so their country can profit. That's the profit motive, right? And that sounds good. And I've heard from libertarians in the past, and you and I have had this conversation, and they say to me, bro, and they always say it like that to me. It's the free market, bro, and just this is how it's supposed to work. But things have gone a little sideways with these nation states and with, in certain cases, these organizations that are trying to promote health, and I use the quotation marks, and then citizens are gaslit over and over again. They're told, "Hey, this is cutting edge. This is going to help you. It's the only way out. It'll save you." So you've got a population that has been convinced that, hey, the WHO is our authority, and you've got countries that want to play along because, hey, we want in on some of these incredible profits that if we sign up and do this and we get a kickback, just like the hospitals did during our little, what I like to call thing-demic that we had back in 2021. So what are your thoughts on that? And how do we, again, use the word decouple, but how does a libertarian say you're vice president and you're talking to President Chase Oliver, right? And you're trying to, formulate a policy. What do you do to both convince the American people and explain at the same time that this is a really raw and bad deal for not just American citizens, but
A
the
lot to
entire.
unpack there. Look,
Sorry.
that's okay. You've got to get a surgeon general who is willing to take on this beast. There is no question. You put your finger right on it. A lot is driven by profit motive, and a lot is driven by political control. And we know that those two things are not always separate, but there are, very powerful humans in this world that are driven by either one or the other, and collectively that makes up a lot of powerful people. The WHO has become quite a marketing and distribution coordination
Right.
organization on behalf of pharmaceuticals and other medical product manufacturers. No question about that. And these are large corporations with quite international interests, frequently American companies, but with quite international interests. And so the idea of having an organization like the WHO knocking down doors on your behalf, opening markets in other nations on your behalf, that is just too good to be true, right? Wouldn't we all love to have some supranational organization suggesting to people all over the world that they need to avail themselves of our product? It doesn't get any better than that. You can see why an international pharmaceutical company CEO would be all about this
Mm-hmm.
and want to support this.
Right.
And of course, we know that the relationship just in the United States, just between the federal government and pharmaceutical companies, just to take one slice of the problem, because you've got this problem at the state level and with other medical product companies that are not pharmaceuticals, but just to take one slice of the problem, we know that we have a huge anti-competitive, anti-market problem in the United States, just with pharmaceuticals no longer facing liability due to side effects of the vaccines. This is just one relatively tight sliver of the problem, but one with which we have become uber familiar since 2020. The idea that the markets can't work correctly because the courts can't work correctly because there has been legislative protection for these companies against their mistakes. So they don't internalize the cost on its own that the vaccines never should have been issued. But it certainly changes the outlook of how these decisions should be made, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there are any number of physicians, researchers in this space who argue that the very decision to issue these vaccines was made incorrectly.
Right.
Think about how important this one set of decisions was, and that it was made at the federal government level, was shoved down the throats of state governments and local governments. The White House used OSHA to shove it down the throats of employees of government contractors, which is to say a huge proportion of our economy, and then picked up and run with by the World Health Organization in effort to distribute these vaccines worldwide, developing a model that is fully in place at this point with, as the WHO believes, the power of treaties behind it to oblige national governments to go along with the program in the future. This is no small potato, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you've got to take on the WHO itself. You've got to blow up this idea that it has the power of ratified treaties. You have got to blow up the idea that government should be involved with science at all. Personally, I believe that we need to institute a framework that suggests, just like we have in the United States, a long tradition, a history of a separation that we honor, a separation between state and church. I believe that we need to honor similarly going forward a separation between state and science. That there is no inherent scientific reason, there is no economic reason why we should tolerate our government being involved in science. It leads to bad decisions about how those results, how the products that result from research are distributed, marketed, and it leads to bad decisions about how resources are deployed in the pursuit of primary science. It's just not an appropriate role for government. It's inefficient. And it leads to this mindset that goes all the way to these supranational organizations like WHO.
Right. Now, if you ever got into office, would you try to repeal the law that was put in 1986 that just gives these guys no liability for these products?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. There is no reason to take away from court, to undermine the role of courts in our society. It is how markets should work. We don't believe in immunity for public officials. I've spent in having I, as you may recall, I'm a former police officer. I spent a tremendous amount of time talking about how we have to replace qualified immunity for police officers and other government officials with a requirement for them to carry their own liability insurance, as doctors do, right? We should not be tolerating any type of diminution of liability. We should not be tolerating immunity at the corporate level or at the agency level or at the individual level. We need courts to work correctly. Otherwise, individuals do not internalize the costs associated with the decisions they make, and they end up making bad decisions.
Do you think it would be a good idea to appoint like a private arbiter independent of, say, the CDC or the FDA who could come in and just be not attached at all to the government and say, okay, we're going to rely on this organization here. And maybe you have more than one that rotate in and out so you don't get cronyism or anything developing where it's like another government contract. But how do you regulate the regulators? I guess that's what my question is.
I think you got to get rid of the regulators and you got to replace it with court action. Ultimately, that's the only system that is going to work. I think that you need private sector organizations that weigh in on best practices,
Mm-hmm.
that will offer the equivalent of a good housekeeping seal of approval, right? But those need to be independent of political organizations. There is no efficiency argument, there's no economic argument that suggests that a political organization should be involved with the development of a regulatory framework, uh, or a best practices outline, or an approval process for drugs, for medical equipment, for other products. There's no reason to believe that that should be a political function. It's just something that we've grown accustomed to in the United States and around the world, and it's inappropriate. It's dopey. There's no reason to believe that. This should be handled in the private sector.
Hmm. Well, that's good stuff. I had another follow up to that. With you mentioned the courts, so we've seen in recent months that the courts have become politicized, and they're using lawfare to do certain things to certain people. And so again, you go down this hopeless trail. You get to the end, and you're like, okay, the courts. We've got the courts, right? They're going to be the neutral arbiters here. And then you find out that the courts are all political appointees and they've got motivations that aren't geared to, following the letter of the law, Mike. So how do we resolve that issue? I mean, what do we do about the courts?
It is difficult, isn't it? And therefore we learn that it is not a silver bullet, but it's a hell of a lot better than a political organization that is political per se.
Mm-hmm.
And it needs to be said that we need to stop tolerating politicians using the courts. In other words, the problem is not merely that the judges themselves are so often politically appointed or elected. These are challenges that we have to overcome. But the problem also is that we have elected officials, district attorneys, for example, who will bring criminal cases against politicians, most famously Donald Trump, but certainly not limited to those examples, where the courts are abused. We know this to be true, but the courts nonetheless do represent the best model for pursuing the internalization of these costs that we want to impose on these companies making decisions. It
Right.
is the best model, and we need to pursue perfecting that.
So if you were vice president again, and you were talking policy with all of the policy experts in your administration, and I imagine there would be fewer policy experts because a libertarian administration would probably be a lot smaller than a Republican or Democrat administration. So you might actually be able to come to a decision quickly rather than having, too many cooks spoil the soup or whatever. Um, would you just say, you know what, we're out of the WHO. There's no reason to be in the WHO. You announce that, and then all hell breaks loose, right? Because you're the worst person on the planet, Mike, because you are risking the health of millions of Americans by not listening to the experts. Isn't that what would probably happen? And I think it would be a delightful thing to see for
Well,
me
certainly
personally.
that would be the spin on CNN. There's no question about that. We do have to decouple from the WHO. We have to get out from under the WHO, and so we would have to resign our membership. That's absolutely critical. The positive spin would be that we would continue to participate with the WHO in terms of sharing information, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we are taking back our policy authority. They were not going to subjugate ourselves to any organization, least of all a World Health Organization. That's just no longer going to be our policy. And then we would spin out and privatize organizations inside the federal government who believe that they have some authority now. One of the things that we saw was that the CDC, which is not per se a regulatory authority, took upon itself to act like one anyway.
Yeah.
This is absolutely revolting.
Right.
And it goes to the point that we were making earlier that these organizations, they don't self-limit in terms of scale and scope and authority and power. They naturally grow when they see an opportunity to do so. And I'm not even suggesting that these people are evil. This is just human nature. And in many, many cases, these are organizations full, I would put the Federal Reserve System in this category, full of smart people, well meaning, wanting to do the right thing, right? Well educated, patriotic people, but who believe that they are smarter than you and me.
Mm-hmm.
In most cases, they probably are smarter than I am. But the one thing I know that they don't seem to know is that they're not as smart as they think they are. They don't make decisions that are as effective as they believe, that they believe in a model that doesn't work. And so we need to take power away from them. We need to devolve their authority to private sector organizations, in some cases to the states. But we need to get out from under this idea that we need federal regulatory authority in science.
And so my guess is you'd probably get rid of the CDC and maybe even the FDA.
Absolutely. The FDA should be privatized and the CDC should be devolved to the states.
No.
The
That
CDC can be privatized as well, but to the extent to which the CDC is just a funnel for federal funds, it needs to end completely. Um, the
yeah.
the FDA is an organization that can be privatized, which is to say, ended and reconstituted in the private sector if somebody wants it. In that sense, I view it the same way as sort of the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. It is, after all, totally funded with our money.
Right.
It should
Right.
be privatized. The FDA should be privatized, and there should be other FDAs. The company should have a choice of regulators, a choice of to whom they go to get approval, and we should learn over time. Pharmacists and doctors in the private sector should learn over time who are the organizations that do a good job of providing this good housekeeping seal of approval, which ones don't, which ones are effectively politically captured by
Mm-hmm.
the organizations that they regulate, and therefore don't serve any value to us at all.
Yeah. Well, one thing we did see during the pandemic was this protocol that was put forth by these organizations that hospitals had to follow. And in some cases, I do a lot of research, and all I can tell you is it's a horror story out there how many people were affected by that protocol, which the doctors were incentivized to do because this is the way we do things, and they're going to get money for doing it, and damn the consequences. Whatever happens, happens, and and also let's try to minimize the plight of these poor people who also went along to get along, and many of them lost their jobs. In some cases, many of them lost their lives. So,
Yeah, you had a real soup of bad incentives. First of all, you had hospitals being paid for certain diagnoses. That's a weird thing. And then they were being subsidized to the extent to which they used certain equipment and certain protocols.
right.
And then if you didn't follow the protocols that were being pushed by the federal government agencies, you would open yourself up to liability, because the presumption in a court would be that the protocol that was coming out of the federal government was the right one, right?
Yeah.
So if you bucked that, you would open yourself up to greater liability, and the insurance companies would be forced to go along with that conceptualization. The guy you want to talk to about this, of course, is Peter McCullough,
Yeah.
who is a leading authority on the institutionalization of protocols and what protocols made sense and which ones don't. We now believe that as many as 100,000 lives were lost by following bad protocols. Think about just never mind bad diagnoses, never mind the absence of correct medicines, never mind the institutionalization of vaccines that weren't ready. Never mind all that. Just following the wrong protocol after you were sick probably cost hundreds of thousands of lives in the United States. That's a real shame. And of course, one of the problems with that is that it was standardized and institutionalized.
Mm-hmm.
So you didn't have hospitals experimenting, states experimenting. You didn't have a diversity of thought, a diversity of treatment, a diversity of medicines being used. You had everyone marching lockstep. It turned out to be wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And so we lost a lot of Americans just because of our political apparatus.
Yeah, and basically that's the WHO on a global scale. And all of that kind of trickles down, filters down to our institutions here, and eventually it makes it to the hospitals because they were. I saw my wife was in that industry at that moment when that was happening, and she would say, yes, on the computer it basically says, if this happens, then do X. If this other thing happens, just do X. And it was just a ridiculous flowchart of insanity, which got worse and worse as it got more severe. The more severe the symptoms, the more ridiculous the protocols became. So I think that when you hear national emergency, how they say, hey, we need emergency use authorization. That to me was the point where we were at an emergency, where the bureaucrats had colluded with the private institutions who were no longer private institutions. That's the way I look at it at that point.
That's right.
And they created
Emergency has
this
just become
monster.
a word that means government takeover.
Yeah. And people just throw it around, and then people are like, oh, there's an emergency. And this is what I mean by the gaslighting that goes on. And people are still scared, Mike. I see them not as often. I'm here in Southwest Florida, but unfortunately, I see these souls that are walking around, and it's almost like a spiritual thing has happened where, I'm a Christian, and I tend to pray in my head for that person, that they would just see and be discerning in this world, which is just it's just seems like one step more, and we just are going over a cliff. I mean, it's the way I feel right now. I don't know if you feel that way, but this stuff, when it comes to the health of human beings, I would think we would be more compassionate animals at that point, where we would say, hey, we could disagree, but if you don't want to do X, you don't have to do X. It's fine. If you're afraid of that, we're not going to continue to gaslight and just pour gasoline on this fire through the media. I mean, do you regulate media institutions? I know I'm a free speecher, right? But if somebody just keeps saying lie after lie after lie, is does the free market speak to that, or how do we remedy that problem?
there's a lot to unpack there. Working backwards, in my view, the problem with the media organizations that we have in the United States, the largest, the most old fashioned at least, is that the government exerts a great deal of influence over them now. And by government, I think I really mean the Republican Party and the Democratic Party exert huge influence over them now. In other words, the solution is not more censorship. It is, in some sense, less relationship with these politically motivated organizations. To your, that's my feeling. I don't have a
Mhm.
silver bullet for fixing that,
Yeah.
except to call it out and hopefully get Americans to recognize that we need a greater diversity of choice in our media availability. We need more people like, for example, David Spurrier. I don't know if you know this guy, but he does a podcast that's very independently minded.
Yeah.
And I'm hoping a lot of people start paying attention to him and people like him. To go to your other point, that you would hope that Americans would behave differently toward each other. I think that we have reached a point in the United States at which people who are well meaning, patriotic people, people who care about each other, just believe that they are so damn smart that
Mm.
the way that that should manifest is that they should make decisions for you.
Yeah.
And this is a problem that people tend to believe in. They wouldn't necessarily use this word, but they tend to believe in socialism when it comes to decision making. Even people who wouldn't buy into the idea of taking your resources, maybe they would. But
Mm.
even if they didn't buy into the idea of taking your resources and controlling your business per se, they still buy into the idea that you're an income poop and we need to make decisions for you, even at the most personal of levels.
Yeah. Well, on that note, let's talk about you and your campaign as we wrap things up here, Mike. How's the campaign going? Have you been running around the country? What's the message that you guys have? And I mean, give
Have
me,
been running around.
yeah,
Will be in West Virginia, Iowa, Rhode Island, New Hampshire coming up soon in the next 2 weeks or so. Florida, Miami, Fort Lauderdale. So it is a busy time, and of course the media contacts are arguably even more important than that. I think that there's a couple of things worth keeping in mind message wise. Of course, the Democrats have begun supporting Tim Walz of Minnesota
right,
as their potential vice presidential nominee. I don't mean to suggest that he's a complete fool or he's a bad guy, but he is a Democratic guy who has not done a lot in his past to evidence a deep commitment to freedom or free markets. He did stand against the bailouts of financial institutions coming out of 2008. He has stood for the decriminalization of cannabis, not the way that we would have hoped. He did sign a bill into law in Minnesota that was not everything that we wish it would be. So he's obviously a compromiser in this regard. He is a guy that doesn't seem to have a problem spending a lot of government resources. And so we don't see him as being a salvation for the Democratic Party, which continues to frustrate us. And I'm sorry about all of that. I think the Democratic Party has left behind what used to be a very important agenda. And now it is true that if you believe in peace over war, if you believe in true social liberalism, if you want to stand against censorship, you should be voting Libertarian. That's the truth of the matter. You may have joined the Democratic Party in good faith, but that party and you have gone in two different directions. And I would say the same thing to my Republican friends who joined that party believing, as I did when I was a Republican many, many years ago, believing in free markets, free trade, a deregulated, pro growth, pro business, pro economy environment. You know, people believing in fiscal conservatism. You and the Republican Party have gone in two different directions. Welcome home to the Libertarian Party. You should be voting for your values and for the change that you want. If you don't vote for your principles and your values, you are wasting your vote. And I encourage all American voters to play a longer game, to vote for the change that you want and force politicians to take into consideration your values and your principles. So that's what we're all about. I do believe that the economy is going to dominate the conversation between now and Election Day. The stock market's downturn is a reflection of people's anticipation of a recession. The recession is a reflection of tight Federal Reserve monetary policy the past 2 years, which is the result of too loose Federal Reserve monetary policy coming out of 2020,
Mm-hmm. Yep.
which of course was the result of the government spending so much money and the government undermining our economy by shutting down businesses. All of this is the result of bad public policy, bad government policy. And the truth of the matter is that it has led to a precarious situation for our economy and a precarious situation for the federal government of the United States. It is my firm belief, and I'm not alone among professional economists, certainly, that the federal government of the United States is going to face a financial collapse before the middle of this century. That's only because I can do arithmetic. It's not
Yeah.
because I have a crystal ball, right?
Right. Right.
It's time for everyone to pick a side. If you still believe in socialism, good for you, but pull your head out of the sand, get in the game, pick a side, and stand up for your fellow Americans and stand against the idea of a federal government collapse, which would prompt a worldwide depression that would disadvantage all of us.
Yeah. Well, we've been spending trillions of dollars that we don't have for quite some time. One thing I love about the Libertarian platform is your stance on being the world's policeman or not being the world's policeman, and essentially bringing a lot of these troops home. We have hundreds of military bases. We found out some folks didn't even know. They were like, "How come we have soldiers in Iraq?" And I was like, "Well, we have a military
And
base there."
Syria.
And Syria. We have a military base there. So people are perplexed. Like, how did we get there so quickly? I'm like, we're already there, you know? So
Yeah.
we're sending troops to places, right? And a lot of people, they don't hear about it in the news because, again, we have a news media that does reporting by omission these days more than just putting out information. Then you decide what you feel about things. I'm glad there's a Libertarian Party. I'm glad RFK Jr. is out there. I'm glad there's a lot of people this time around that you can take a look at. Whether you're more progressive, you can look at Jill Stein. Whether you're, more libertarian, there's always a choice out there to kind of decouple, as I've been using that word a lot in this video, from the two political parties and the political establishment. Mike, I'm glad you're on this journey. I wish you and your running mate, Chase Oliver, the best. Tell us about where, if someone wants to support you guys, I'm sure you need money to do this, and I'm sure you'd
Thank you.
love to tell people where
we
to
do.
do that.
We're not one of those campaigns that is awash with cash. Every dollar matters. Go to MikeTerMaat.com or VoteChaseOliver.com. MikeTerMaat.com is a little bit tricky. You got to remember there's two A's in it. You can read about our campaign there. VoteChaseOliver.com. You can sign up to volunteer. We do need your financial support. Every dollar absolutely matters. We're one of those campaigns that uses our dollars to travel, to get the message out. This is not a campaign that has an extra, $1 million laying around to run stupid ads. We are all about the hard work. This is boots on the ground. Your dollars will really make a difference. Trust me on this. Every penny absolutely matters. It gets a good message out and forces the Republicans and the Democrats to take us into consideration. And remember, we are polling above 4% in many states. That's a big deal. We can reach a turning point at which we really play a major role in American politics, but we need the resources to get that done.
Yeah, I can't remember a political cycle where there was this much turmoil, and I would call it agnosticism, political agnosticism. Like one week you're for this guy, the next week you're not, and there's just there's I've never seen anything like this. So if anyone wants to vote their conscience, check out the campaign, the Libertarian campaign for president. Mike ter Maat, the nominee for vice president. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, David. Good to be with you.